Hello everyone. This is the first video in a new series called Second Look. In this series, I'm going to take a look at pictures that I've shown in a previous video from my In the Field series and talk about my thoughts about each picture after the fact. What worked, what didn't work, and try to come up with some lessons to learn from my past experience and what I can use from them to grow in the future if I were to do either the same shoot again or just trying to capture some takeaways from the mistakes that I've made to improve future photos. So if you haven't already looked at the video for In the Field San Francisco Botanical Garden, that's the one you'll want to take a look at before this, because those are the photos that I'm going to review in this one. So you can see we're going to go through 8 photos pretty quickly. Not all of these will have a lot of things to say about them, but at least a few of them will be worth spending a bit of time on. So we'll start off with this one. This was the couple of birds that I spotted by the pond in the area right when you first come in the side entrance. And right away, what I see from looking at this is that I remember how frustrated I was that the only lens I had with me was the 24-70, because there's really a lot in this picture that doesn't add to the bird, which is the obvious subject. The bird in the front on the rock is really what I would have liked to focus on. And this was already about as zoomed in as I can get. I believe this was at, this was at 70 millimeters. So I couldn't go in any farther than this. And it just really doesn't make that compelling of a composition compared to what I could get if I was able to fill most of the frame with the bird on the rock. So this, you'll see just from this picture and from a couple of others, this outing to the Botanical Garden was definitely the main motivator in picking up the 70 to 200 telephoto lens sooner than I would have otherwise. When I got the full frame camera, the 60 Mark II, I just got the 24-70 with it, and I wanted to see how far that would take me. I knew that I'd get the 70 to 200 eventually, but I didn't realize how quickly I was going to run into situations where it would have really been the difference between a great shot and a kind of a mediocre shot. So this was one that I think would have been completely changed by being able to go in a lot closer. And I'm sure that anyone who is familiar with wildlife photography would have told me that, yes, absolutely, you're not going to get anywhere with a 24-70 lens trying to photograph wildlife. Now, one thing I got lucky with here is that this bird was very still. So I think I had a few shots in this series, and he was always facing away from me in terms of body position. But I got this good one where he was able to turn his head, so that helped a bit. I also did quite a bit of dodging and burning on this particular image to really bring that bird out of the background, because he's on a pretty noisy background. So given what I was able to get in frame, I think it works okay. There's just a lot more than I would like. Also, you'll notice that that second bird that's up in the tree kind of towards the middle of the frame near the top, it was such a bright white bird with not a lot of detail that it was really kind of hard to make out what it is in the final picture, which once again detracts from the main focus, which is the heron in the front. And that's just kind of a shame that I wasn't able to frame this better. I have another picture of the bird on the top later, which we'll see a little bit closer, a little bit more focused, but I think just because of the nature of what that bird looked like, it's hard to tell what it is. I think if you didn't see the other bird in context, you might not even know that it was a bird. I think even given that, it's still a little bit difficult to tell what it's supposed to be. Color-wise, I think this worked out okay. It's really kind of a noisy image, and this is one of the hard things about taking photos in a forested area, is that it's just a lot of stuff in the image. There's some nice colors, especially the tree on the left where the white bird is. But I don't know that it goes that well with the big branches that are kind of in front of it, and then again that we see behind the heron that's in the front on the rock. I'm guessing that in the summertime those branches have leaves or maybe flowers on them, and so it's partially just a result of having been there in January in the winter that it looked like this. It looks a little bit barren. So I think the main takeaway on this was just the motivation to get a more telephoto lens that I could use for situations like this. Now this photo I used as an example of trying to pick out something in a composition to really draw the eye in terms of contrast. And I talked about how in a previous trip to the Botanical Garden, I'd taken some pictures where the scene looked really nice to me while I was there, but then when I looked at my composition later, it really wasn't that interesting because there wasn't an obvious point of focus. There wasn't an obvious subject. And even though it was generally pleasant, that didn't really make for a compelling photograph. And in this one, I tried to pay special attention to that problem that I had previously by looking for more focused contrast, either in color or in tone, to try to focus the viewer's eye on a particular part of the image and make it really clear what you're supposed to be looking at. And I think I actually didn't do as well as I would have hoped, given that I was using this one as an example. You can see that in this scene, the light is coming from behind. And even though the red plants are lit up nicely by the sun at the top, by putting that sort of fern-looking plant on the left, the green one, in frame also, that's a much lighter tone, and I find that that really draws my eye more than the red plants do. And as a result, it's kind of muddled in terms of what the focus is. It seems like it's supposed to be, my intention was that it would be the red plants because of their contrast to the surrounding green tones. But because of the light hitting that green fern so directly and it being so bright in comparison to the fairly dark reds, I think that really kind of brings too much attention away from the reds. So this would have maybe been better from a slightly different angle. You can see that because of the red plant that's in the foreground, the closest one, the largest one, is some of its edges are going in front of the light green plant, that I don't think it would have worked to just zoom in a little bit more or get a little bit closer, because I still wouldn't have been able to get all of the fronds of that red plant without cutting it off if I was going to try to get the green plant out of the image. So I think I would have had to change the angle a little bit, step kind of to my left from the vantage point that we're seeing here in order to sort of hone in on that. But it also makes me realize that the red plants are really maybe not as bright as I would have liked. If we imagine cutting out that plant on the left to some degree, the green plant, the contrast is really not as good as it was, and there's not really as clear of an edge between the background and the foreground, given that there are dark elements of both. So I think I would have really benefited from working this shot some more and trying to find an angle that looked better, or maybe even trying it from the other side, given that I like the backlight on here, but the backlight really works better on the green plant than it does on the red ones. So I think I maybe should have explored that a little more and seen if there was a better contrast from the other side. This is an example, I think, of needing to learn how to balance the still photography that I'm doing with vlogging what I'm doing, because even though this looks pretty nice, the light was a lot better when I got there and I started doing the vlog talking about what I was about to shoot. And it was late enough in the afternoon that the light was changing fast enough that by the time I actually took this shot, the light had moved off of the rocks, and you can see the light is really hitting the plant in the middle a little bit better than it is the rocks, especially the rock on the right. I think the rock on the left has a decent amount of light on it, but when I got there, the light on the right rock was much brighter on the top of it and really drew attention to it. This picture is okay, but it could have been a little better if I had worked a little bit faster, maybe taken the picture before talking about it on video. That's a hard thing to balance because I want to present it in an honest way where what I'm talking about is actually what I intend to do rather than something I've already done. But maybe for the sake of getting a good shot, that isn't always the wisest thing to do. The other thing that kind of bothers me about this after the fact is that plant that's right in the middle has very similar tones to the tree that's in the background. So it's kind of hard to see the edges of that plant versus the tree. I tried to do some dodging and burning to make that a little bit more apparent, but the tones are just so similar that I find it doesn't really work that well. And the only reason that really matters is, again, because of the loss of light on the rocks. I think because the rocks are not as bright as I would have liked, even with some dodging. It kind of draws your eye to where the light is, which is on that middle bush. And as a result, then you come into problems with the background being a similar tone. I also think that the bush in the foreground on the left, in front of the left rock, is not all that interesting. Like looking at that by itself makes me feel like I should have zoomed in a little bit more and had a little bit less of that in the frame, because there's not really much to look at there. Problem with that is that it would also cut off the plant in the bottom right, which I think is a bit more interesting with its very sort of thin fronds, and creates a nice sort of fan look. So I think it's okay as it was. And again, I think the real lesson here is just to take advantage of the light while it's in the spot you want, and to work a little bit more quickly. This image I used again as an example of a way to look for a composition among a lot of busy plants and branches, to try to isolate a particular part of the surroundings to focus the viewer's eye on. And in this case, rather than looking for contrast of color, I was looking for contrast of tone. And I used this section of light that was coming through this shadowed area where these two men were sitting on a bench reading books, to try to create that interest by showing the contrast between the bright area and the shadow. Again, I think this is it's an okay image. I think that the two men sitting on the bench are pretty small in the frame, and I'm not thrilled with this because it's not super clear to me whether just the contrast of light and shadow is what's supposed to make this interesting, or whether the people on the bench are the subject, in which case they're really too small to see. Which can work sometimes, like if you're trying to show the sort of the comparison in size between a person and their surroundings. Like something like this can serve to show how large the area is, or how small or insignificant a human feels among nature. But I don't know that that works so well here, because you also have this sort of extreme contrast between light and shadow. So it kind of, for me, when I'm looking at it again, it sort of fights my attention for, do I care about that contrast of tones and the shadow and this kind of beautiful light that's coming through and lighting up these trees in the middle, or do I care about the people? And I find that my attention's a little bit divided on that. So again, if I had had a telephoto lens, maybe there is a more compelling composition I could have gotten here, or maybe just by moving closer to them. Although, of course, I didn't know these people, so I didn't really want to disturb them by getting right up in their face with a camera. So again, a telephoto lens would have been helpful, I think, to maybe try some other compositions that maybe keep a little bit more of a little bit of the contrast of shadow and light in the frame, but zero in a little bit closer on the people, so you get a little bit of their faces in the shot, a little bit more character, and just more of the frame is filled with the human element of the composition. Also, the sky is a bit dull. I tried to improve it a little bit by just increasing some contrast and adding a little bit of saturation. But you can see it's totally cloudless, so it looks a bit flat, and there's not a whole lot I could have done about that. Obviously, I don't control the sky, but it's just another element of what makes the composition feel a little less than maybe it could have been. This shot had probably the most compelling light of the trip, with this sort of backlit subject of the light shining through the trees and just hitting the edge of this branch. Again, I'm not really thrilled with the result of this one. Although the light is pretty, I find that so much of the frame is kind of not that interesting. The parts in shadow just don't really add much to it to me. I think the sort of the messiness of the shapes really detract from me, and I'm not sure really. This is the one image in the series where I'm really not sure what I would have done differently on this one. Maybe tried a few different angles. Maybe again, if I had been a little more telephoto or zoomed in a little more, or just tried to have a little bit less in the frame. I remember what I was going for at the time was the path that you see on the left there that was in front of me kind of curves around this lit bush to the right. And I was trying to kind of show sort of the curve of the road behind the plant and in front of the dark tree. I think I think it's maybe not as clear as I would have liked that the path is there, since most of it is in shadow. So maybe it would have helped to dodge that a little bit, but then you lose some of the contrast between the dark road and the plant where the light is hitting it. So I think maybe this is about as good as I could have done, and it's just a decent composition, but not a great one. This is the one that I spent the most time on editing, and originally I didn't plan to do as much editing as I did, but I'll show you the original in a minute so you can see exactly what I did. The main thing I liked in this image was just the shape of this tree in the foreground. I think it's really pretty. I love the sort of wispy nature of the branches and this almost sort of like mathematical fractal shape that is being created. The difficult part about this image, for the most part, was the lack of contrast between the green tones of the tree and the green tones of the trees in the background. You can see they're all pretty similar, so the edges of the tree are kind of fall away into the background much more than I would have liked. And I did do a decent bit of dodging and burning on this, but I find that it still really doesn't stand out as much as I'd like. So perhaps I could have done a little more dodging and burning, but I think it was already kind of getting pushed to the limit. Maybe I should have tried this in black and white so I could have controlled those tones in the back a little bit differently. The fact that they're all sort of green and slightly yellowish tones that makes the color not as effective as it could be. Because in addition to brightness, they're also the same hue, which just is kind of a double whammy in terms of not being able to see the distinction between the edge of the tree in the foreground and the trees in the back. So I think that was probably the main thing that didn't work here. Again, I could have maybe gotten a little bit closer or tried a slightly different angle to try to get a little bit less of the surrounding area into the photo, because I think the sort of the leafless tree on the top left area doesn't really add a lot. I mean, it's good in terms of contrast. I think that would have been a better background than the green trees, because you can certainly see the edge of the foreground tree better against that than you can against the ones at the top. But it's also not that pretty to look at without any leaves. It kind of is just a scraggly mess without anything to really focus your eyes on. Maybe it makes it for an interesting texture, but since it's not the subject of the image, I think it can be a little bit distracting. I also liked the way that the bridge and the road kind of surrounded this tree and created a bit of a natural framing. So that part of it I think came out okay. There's maybe a little bit too much foreground in the bottom left corner, so maybe even just a crop on this would have made it a little bit better. So the other part that I'm pretty happy with is the editing of removing things from the picture that were very distracting. I want you to take a look at the foreground, especially around the bridge and in front of the central tree, to see if any of that looks odd to you, because there's a lot that I removed. And I did this in Affinity Photo rather than Photoshop, because it has a tool called the in-painting brush, and it works kind of like the content-aware fill in Photoshop, but I actually find it much easier to use. Essentially, it's just a paintbrush, and you paint over the parts of the image that you want to intelligently remove, and it does a content-aware fill on the parts that you've painted as soon as you let go of the mouse, or lift your pen if you're using a tablet. And I find it actually does a really excellent job in terms of making the replaced area look natural. So let's take a look here at the original. Now you can see all of the things that I removed. So there's this little rope sort of fence that's on the right side of the bridge and in front of the tree. The sticks and the ropes connecting the sticks, or the poles, I guess. And there's some on the left side too, in front of that bush and the little smaller tree. And then you can see there's also a big plaque on behind the tree on sort of the bottom right corner that was information about the plants in the area, and I think a map of the surrounding areas. And then behind the tree, farther to the right in the foreground, there's a bench that I also removed. So now that you see all that stuff, if I switch back to the painted away image, you can see that it actually really works amazingly well. And while I was there, I wasn't even expecting that I would be able to remove all of that so effectively. There's a couple of places I think I can sort of spot that there was some duplication from the in-painting brush. But overall, I think because of the sort of messy, busy nature of the plants in this photo, I think it's really not noticeable at all, especially if you didn't know what it looked like originally. So this is one I'm really happy with in terms of cloning and being able to remove elements of the image in sort of a seamless way. On my way out, I returned to the pond, and the birds that I was looking at the beginning were still there. And so in this case, I went to the other side of the pond to see if I could get a closer or better image of the birds that were there. And this is the white bird that we saw in that first image that was up on the branch at the top. And again, you can see that it's really kind of difficult to make out what it is. Again, because I didn't have a telephoto lens with me. This is as close as I could get at 70 millimeters. And I find that it just doesn't really work very well because the subject is so small in the frame. So I don't know that there's a whole lot to critique, given that I knew that I was not using a lens that was appropriate for the situation. I guess there's still a bit of interest just in the contrast of this very, very bright bird to the much darker tree that's surrounding it. And I did also a lot of burning on the bird because it's so white that it's actually, even in person, was very difficult to see any sort of detail on what it was. Burning it gave maybe a little bit of depth, but again, it's so small in the frame that I think it's really doesn't make a huge difference. This was good practice, however, in blending multiple exposures, because if you take a look here at the original raw files for this, I had this sort of lighter exposure, which I used to get the detail in the tree, and then I have this darker exposure that got a little bit more of the detail of the bird and also a better angle of the bird with its head turned to the left, where you can see the beak a little bit better than this one. So in this final image, you can actually see as I change back and forth here, you can see the sort of halo of burning that I left around the bird, which is a little unfortunate. I think I could have done a more precise job on burning with the bird. But because this wasn't a great image in the first place, I think maybe it wasn't worth any additional effort on that. And it was really just good practice as a way of doing a sort of a manual exposure blending, which I think maybe even prior to this specific image, I had only ever done by using the automatic HDR merging in Lightroom or Affinity Photo. And in this one, I did it manually by layering the two exposures on top of each other in Photoshop and masking in the bird from the darker exposure with the better position onto the lighter exposure of the trees. So I think it except for where you see the halo around the bird from the sloppy burning, I think the exposure blend actually worked pretty well, and I definitely feel more confident in trying to do that kind of work again. Finally, this image that I showed at the very end of the video was just trying to show a little bit of the last light of the day that was hitting the trees and get a little bit more of a sort of a zoomed out view of what the botanical gardens looks like. This image was a little tricky to get because there was a road right below the bottom edge of the crop, and there were people that kept walking by it, so it took a while to get a composition where I didn't have a person's head sticking into it. This is also HDR, actually. I think this is maybe 3 exposures blended together, just because the shadows in the foregrounds was quite a different level of light and brightness than the lighter parts of the trees and the sky too. At this point, I was actually getting a little bit of cloud, so there's a little bit of texture to the sky that makes it a little more interesting than some of the other shots where it was just solid blue without much to look at. So here you don't see a lot of blue peeking through, but a good enough amount that I wanted to make sure that the sky wasn't completely blown out. So with I think this came out pretty well in terms of an automatic HDR. I think I did this one in Lightroom, just an automatic merge together, and it's not an amazing image in terms of like having a particular element that's interesting to look at. I think you could maybe even argue that it doesn't have a very obvious subject, although I tend to think of it as the tree that's kind of the most contrasty and slightly off to the right center. That's kind of what I was imagining the subject to be, but you could maybe also say that it's the larger bush in front of that in the front, which also takes up a pretty significant amount of the frame. But I think the really just the contrast between sort of the tree line and the sky, with a little bit of foreground interest from these bushes of different colors, makes for kind of a pleasant image. So nothing really more to talk about on this one. I think it turned out fine. And with that, I have come to the end of the images of my trip to the San Francisco Botanical Garden. I hope that analysis of my images after the fact was interesting for you and maybe helpful in a way to think about what you can learn from your past work and from mistakes, and learn from things that went well by taking a closer look at them and sort of analyzing them critically. I'll be doing more of these videos in the future, so stay tuned for those, and thanks for watching.